Hello, listening squirrels. My little coffin's over here flashing, which I'm going to turn off in case it bothers anybody. I started the Bod Moss Stitch hat using this, which is the marl, natural marl. The Moss Stitch beanie from Bod. I don't know if I was liking that or not. Look at this. And I know hers was wavy too. She said, don't worry if it's a little wavy at the beginning. Or, you know. Out of this beautiful stuff, glowing, something sage. Sage and song. Yarn be glowing. Look how pretty that is. The more interesting your yarn is color-wise, I think the better the moss stitch looks. And this looks kind of fally, I think. I may still do this one too, but I thought I'd try this anyway. I was getting a little bit lost with just this one color. And I know I've done moss stitch enough I ought to be a really an expert at this, but I am not. I have never done moss stitch in the round. You know? So, it's a challenge for the challengers. Alright, we are on chapter 11, I believe. Yeah. Last thing Tommy said was, well, somebody said, who said? Albert. Albert said, you mean you're taking it to Scotland Yard? And Tommy said, no, I'm taking it to Bond Street. And I said, Bond, James Bond. So chapter 11 is Bond Street and Dr. Murray. Tommy jumped out of a taxi, paid the driver, and leaned back into the cab to take out a rather clumsily done-up parcel, which was clearly a picture. Tucking as much of it as he could under his arm, he entered the new Athenian Galleries, one of the longest established and most important picture galleries in London. He's going to find out about the artist, I guess. Tommy was not a great patron of the arts, but he had come to the new Athenian because he had a friend who officiated there. Officiated was the only word to use because the air of sympathetic interest, the hushed voice, the pleasurable smile, all seemed highly ecclesiastical. A fair-haired young man detached himself and came forward, his face lighting up with a smile of recognition. Hello, Tommy, he said. Haven't seen you for a long time. What's that you got under your arm? Don't tell me you've been taking to painting pictures in your old age. I think it's crazy that Tommy and Tuppence are seniors. A lot of people do. Results usually deplorable. I doubt if creative art was ever my long suit, said Tommy, though I must admit I found myself strongly attracted the other day by a small book telling in the simplest terms how a child of 5 can learn to paint in watercolors. God help us if you're going to take to that. Grandma Moses in reverse. To tell you the truth, Robert, I merely want to appeal to your expert knowledge of pictures. I want your opinion on this. This is funny because Robert is the name of my Lindsay, my eldest daughter. One of her high school friends was is it called curator in a art gallery? You know, that tells about the stuff. I guess that's what he did. I don't know. Just the name Robert. Deftly, Robert took the picture from Tommy and skillfully removed its clumsy wrappings with the expertise of a man accustomed to handle the parceling up and deparceling of all different sized works of art. He took the picture and set it on a chair, peered into it to look at it, and then withdrew 5 or 6 steps away. He turned his gaze towards Tommy. "Well," he said, "what about it? What do you want to know? Do you want to sell it? Is that it?" "No," said Tommy, "I don't want to sell it, Robert. I want to know about it. To begin with, I want to know who painted it." "Actually," said Robert, if you had wanted to sell it, it would be quite sellable nowadays. It wouldn't have been 10 years ago, but Bosco's, that's the name, just coming into fashion again." "Bosco?" Tommy looked at him inquiringly. "Is that the name of the artist? I saw it was signed with something beginning with B, but I couldn't read the name." "Oh, it's Bosco all right. Very popular painter about 25 years ago. Sold well. Had plenty of shows. People bought him all right. Technically a very good painter. Then in the usual cycle of events, he went out of fashion. Finally, hardly any demand at all for his works, but lately he's had a revival. He, Stitchwort, W-O-R-T, and Fondella, they're all coming up." "Boscowan," repeated Tommy. "Boscowan," said Robert obligingly. "Is he still painting?" "No, he's dead. Died some years ago. Quite an old chap by then. 65, I think. That is not old." 63. When he died. Quite a prolific painter, you know. A lot of his canvases about. Actually, we're thinking of having a show of him here in about 4 or 5 months' time. We ought to do well over it, I think. Why are you so interested in him?" "It'd be too long a story to tell you," said Tommy. "One of these days I'll ask you out to lunch and give you the doings from the beginning. It's a long, complicated, and really rather an idiotic story. All I wanted to know was all about this Boscowan, and if you happen to know by any chance where this house is that's represented here." "I couldn't tell you the last for a moment. It's the sort of thing he did paint, you know. Small country houses in rather isolated spots, usually. Sometimes a farmhouse, sometimes just a cow or two around, sometimes a farm cart. But if so, in the far distance, quiet rural scenes, nothing sketchy or messy. Sometimes the surface looks almost like enamel. It was a peculiar technique and people liked it. A good many of the things he painted were in France, Normandy mostly. Churches. I've got one picture of his here now. Wait a minute, I'll get it for you." He went to the head of the staircase and shouted down to someone below. Presently he came back holding a small canvas, which he propped on another chair. "There you are," he said. "Church in Normandy." "Yes," said Tommy, "I see. The same sort of thing. My wife says nobody ever lived in that house, the one I brought in. I see now what she meant. I don't see that anybody was attending service in that church or ever will." "Well, perhaps your wife's got something. Quiet, peaceful dwellings with no human occupancy. He didn't often paint people, you know. Sometimes there's a figure or two in the landscape, but more often not. In a way, I think that gives them their special charm, a sort of isolationist feeling. It was as though he removed all the human beings and the peace of the countryside was all the better without them. Come to think of it, that's maybe why the general taste has swung round to him. Too many people nowadays, too many cars, too many noises on the road, too much noise and bustle. Peace, perfect peace, leave it all to nature. Yes, I shouldn't wonder. What sort of man was he? I didn't know him personally before my time. Pleased with himself by all accounts. Thought he was a better painter than he was, probably. Put on a bit of a side, quite likable eye for the girls. And you've no idea where this particular piece of countryside exists? It is England, I suppose. I should think so, yes. Do you want me to find out for you? Could you? Probably the best thing to do would be to ask his wife, his widow rather. He married Emma Wing, the sculptor, well known, not very productive, does quite powerful work. You could go and ask her. She lives in Hampstead. I could give you the address. We've been corresponding with her a good deal lately over the question of this show of her husband's work we're doing. We're having a few of her smaller pieces of sculpture as well. I'll get the address for you. That's great. He went to the desk, turned over a ledger, scrawled something on a card, and brought it back. There you are, Tommy, he said. I don't know what the deep, dark mystery is. Always been a man of mystery, haven't you? It's a nice representation of Bosco's work you've got there. We might like to use it for the show. I'll send you a line to remind you nearer the time. You don't know a Mrs. Lancaster, do you? Well, I can't think of one offhand. Is she an artist or something of the kind? No, I don't think so. She's just an old lady living for the last few years in an old ladies' home. She comes into it because this picture belonged to her until she gave it away to an aunt of mine. Well, I can't say the name means anything to me. Better go and talk to Mrs. Bosco. What's she like? She was a good bit younger than he was, I should say. Quite a personality. He nodded his head once or twice. Yes, quite a personality. You'll find that out, I expect. He took the picture. He took the picture, handed it down the staircase with instructions to someone below to do it up again. Nice for you having so many myrmidons, I guess helpers, at your beck and call, said Tommy. Let me look that up. Myrmidons. Myrmidon, a member of a warlike Thessalian people no, that's not it. A hired ruffian. Well, that's not it. We're unscrupulous subordinate. I don't know why I call him that. Anyway. He looked around him, noticing his surroundings for the first time. What's this you've got here now? He said with distaste. Paul Jagerowski, interesting young Slav, said to produce all his works under the influence of drugs. Don't you like him? Tommy concentrated his gaze on a big string bag which seemed to have enmeshed itself in a metallic green field full of distorted cows. Frankly, no. Philistine, said Robert, come out and have a bite of lunch. Can't. I've got a meeting with a doctor at my club. Not ill, are you? I'm in the best of health. My blood pressure is so good that it disappoints every doctor to whom I submit it. Then what do you want to see a doctor for? Oh, said Tommy cheerfully, I've just got to see a doctor about a body. Said a man about a dog. Thanks for your help. Goodbye. Part 2. Tommy greeted Dr. Murray with some curiosity. He presumed it was some formal matter to do with Aunt Ada's decease, but why on earth Dr. Murray would not at least mention the subject of his visit over the telephone, Tommy couldn't imagine. "I'm afraid I'm a little late," said Dr. Murray, shaking hands, "but the traffic was pretty bad and I wasn't exactly sure of the locality. I don't know this part of London very well." "Well, too bad you had to come all the way here," said Tommy. "I could have met you somewhere more convenient, you know." You've time on your hands just then, just now?" "Just at the moment, yes. I've been away for the last week." "Yes, I believe someone told me so when I rang up." Tommy indicated a chair, suggested refreshment, placed cigarettes and matches by Dr. Murray's side, but the two men had established themselves when the two men had established themselves comfortably, Dr. Murray opened the conversation. "I'm sure I've aroused your curiosity," he said, "but as a matter of fact, we're in a spot of trouble at Sunny Ridge. It's a difficult and perplexing matter, and in one way it's nothing to do with you. I've no earthly right to trouble you with it, but there's just an off chance that you might know something which would help me." "Well, of course I'll do anything I can. Something to do with my aunt, Miss Fanshawe?" "Not directly, no, but in a way she does come into it. I can speak to you in confidence, can I, Mr. Beresford?" "Yes, certainly." "As a matter of fact, I was talking the other day to a mutual friend of ours. He was telling me a few things about you. I gather that in the last war you had rather a delicate assignment." "Oh, I wouldn't put it quite as seriously as that," said Tommy in his most non-committal manner. "Oh, no, I quite realize that it's not a thing to be talked about. I don't really think that matters nowadays. It's a good long time since the war. My wife and I were younger then. Anyway, it's nothing to do with that I want to talk to you about, but at least I feel that I can speak frankly to you, that I can trust you not to repeat what I'm now saying, though it's possible that it all may have to come out later." "A spot of trouble at Sunny Ridge, you say?" "Yes. Not very long ago, one of our patients died, a Mrs. Moody. I don't know if you ever met her, or if your aunt ever talked about her." "Mrs. Moody?" Tommy reflected. "No, I don't think so. Anyway, not so far as I remember." "She was one of our older patients. She was still on the right side of 70, and she was not seriously ill in any way. It was just a case of a woman with no near relatives and no one to look after her in the domestic line. She fell into the category of what I often call to myself a flutterer. Women who more and more resemble hens as they grow older. They cluck. They forget things. Oh, Lord, this is me. They run themselves into difficulties and they worry. Oh, gosh, this is me. They get themselves riled up about nothing at all. I try not. There's very little the matter with them. They're not, strictly speaking, mentally disturbed, but they just cluck," Tommy suggested. "As you say, Mrs. Moody clucked. She caused the nurses a fair amount of trouble, although they were quite fond of her. She had a habit of forgetting when she'd had her meals, making a fuss because no dinner had been served to her, when, as a matter of fact, she had actually just eaten a very good dinner." "Oh," said Tommy, "enlightened Mrs. Coco?" That's what I was thinking. The one that always wanted Coco. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm sorry," said Tommy. "It's a name my wife and I had for her. She was yelling for Nurse Jane one day when we passed along the passage and saying she hadn't had her Coco. Rather a nice-looking, scatty little woman, but it made us both laugh, and we fell into the habit of calling her Mrs. Coco." "And so she's died?" I wasn't particularly surprised when the death happened, said Dr. Murray. To be able to prophesy with any exactitude when an elderly woman will die is practically impossible. Women whose health is seriously affected, who one feels as a result of physical examination will hardly last the year out, sometimes are good for another 10 years. They have a tenacious hold on life which mere physical disability will not quench. And there are other people whose health is reasonably good and who may, one thinks, make old bones. They, on the other hand, catch bronchitis or flu, seem unable to have the stamina to recuperate from it, and die with surprising ease. So, as I say, as a medical attendant to an elderly ladies' home, I'm not surprised when what might be called a fairly unexpected death occurs. This case of Mrs. Moody, however, was somewhat different. She died in her sleep without having exhibited any sign of illness, and I could not help feeling that, in my opinion, her death was unexpected. I'll use the phrase that has always intrigued me in Shakespeare's play Macbeth. I have always wondered what Macbeth meant when he said of his wife, "She should have died hereafter." Yes, I remember wondering once myself what Shakespeare was getting at, said Tommy. I forgot whose production it was and who was playing Macbeth, but there was a strong suggestion in that particular production, and Macbeth certainly played it in a way to suggest that he was hinting to the medical attendant that Lady Macbeth would be better out of the way. Presumably, the medical attendant took the hint. It was then that Macbeth, feeling safe after his wife's death, feeling that she could no longer damage him by her indiscretions or her rapidly failing mind, expresses his genuine affection and grief for her. She should have died hereafter. And that's in quotes. Exactly, said Dr. Murray. It's what I felt about Mrs. Moody. I felt that she should have died hereafter, not just 3 weeks ago of no apparent cause. Tommy did not reply. He merely looked at the doctor inquiringly. Medical men have certain problems. If you are puzzled over the cause of a patient's death, there's only one way to tell. By postmortem. Postmortems are not appreciated by relatives of the deceased. Excuse me. But if a doctor demands a postmortem and the result is, as it perfectly well may be, a case of natural causes or some disease or malady which does not always give outward signs or symptoms, then the doctor's career can be quite seriously affected by his having made a questionable diagnosis. I can see that it must have been difficult. The relatives in question are distant cousins, so I took it upon myself to get their consent, as it was a matter of medical interest to know the cause of death. When a patient dies in her sleep, it's advisable to add to one's medical knowledge. I wrapped it up a good bit, mind you, didn't make it too formal. Luckily, they couldn't care less. I felt very relieved in mind once the autopsy had been performed, and if all was well, I could give a death certificate without a qualm. Anyone can die of what is amateurishly called heart failure, from one of several different causes. Actually, Mrs. Moody's heart was in really very good shape for her age. 70, whatever. She suffered from arthritis and rheumatism and occasional trouble with her liver, but none of these things seemed to accord with her passing away in her sleep. Dr. Murray came to a stop. Tommy opened his lips and then shut them again. The doctor nodded. Yes, Mr. Beresford, you can see where I am tending. Death has resulted from an overdose. Death has resulted from an overdose of morphine. Good Lord! Tommy stared and the ejaculation escaped him. Yes, it seemed quite incredible, but there was no way of getting away from the analysis. The question was, how was that morphia administered? She was not on morphia. She was not a patient who suffered pain. Dang, with all that arthritis and stuff. There were 3 possibilities, of course. She might have taken it by accident. Unlikely. She might have got hold of some other patient's medicine by mistake, but that again is not particularly likely. Patients are not entrusted with supplies of morphia, and we do not accept drug addicts who might have a supply of such things in their possession. It could have been a deliberate suicide, but I should be very slow to accept that. Mrs. Moody, though a worrier, was of a perfectly cheerful disposition, and I'm quite sure had never thought of ending her life. The third possibility is that a fatal overdose was deliberately administered to her, but by whom and why? Naturally, there are supplies of morphia and other drugs which Miss Packard, as a registered hospital nurse and matron, is perfectly entitled to have in her possession, and which she keeps in a locked cupboard. In such cases as sciatica or rheumatoid arthritis, there can be such severe and desperate pain that morphia is occasionally administered. We had hoped that we may come across some circumstance in which Mrs. Moody had a dangerous amount of morphia administered to her by mistake, or which she herself took under the delusion that it was a cure for indigestion or insomnia. We've not been able to find any such circumstances possible. The next thing we have done, at Miss Packard's suggestion, and I agreed with her, is to look carefully into the records of such deaths as have taken place at Sunny Ridge in the last 2 years. There have not been many of them, I'm glad to say. I think 7 in all, which is a pretty fair average for people of that age group. 2 deaths of bronchitis, perfectly straightforward. 2 of flu, always a possible killer during the winter months, owing to the slight resistance offered by frail elderly women, and 3 others. He paused and said, Mr. Beresford, I'm not satisfied about those 3 others, certainly not about 2 of them. They were perfectly probable. They were not unexpected, but I will go as far as saying that they were unlikely. They're not cases that, on reflection and research, I'm entirely satisfied about. One has to accept the possibility that, unlikely as it seems, there is someone at Sunny Ridge who is, possibly for mental reasons, a killer. An entirely unsuspected killer. There was silence for some moments. Tommy gave a sigh. I don't doubt what you've told me, he said, but all the same, frankly, it seems unbelievable. These things, surely they can't happen. Oh, yes, said Dr. Murray grimly, they happen all right. You go over some of the pathological cases. A woman who took on domestic service. She worked as a cook in various households. She was a nice, kind, pleasant-seeming woman. Gave her employees, I said eyebrows. Lord. Worked as a cook. She was nice and pleasant. Seemed gave her employers faithful service, cooked well, enjoyed being with them, yet sooner or later things happened, usually a plate of sandwiches, sometimes picnic food. For no apparent motive, arsenic was added, 2 or 3 poisoned sandwiches among the rest. Apparently sheer chance dictated who took and ate them. There seemed no personal venom. Whew. I think I'm going to stop there, guys. Now watch it have. I'm seeing how long it is. Nah. It's not real long, but I'll save it for mañana. Mañana. Okie dokie. Okie dokie. See y'all. See you gators later. Ow. Ooh. Hit my funny bone, and it wasn't funny. Love you bunches. Be sweet. Don't be ugly.